Can you guys hear me okay? Do I need to say got it? Okay. Okay. Thanks for the super generous introduction. Excited to be here. This project is definitely sort of like at the heart of what Florian was talking about and thinking about how people think about possibilities and the role that might play in a lot of different things that we care about. So one thing that, just to give you a sense for this project and how I got started, is a lot of what I'd been doing was sort of asking people or little kids or whoever explicitly about what's possible or not possible, and then trying to understand like how we reason about possibility that way. But then I had this sense that like, often when we're making decisions in life, like let's say you're like, or watching someone else make a decision, say you have a sense of like the things that they could have done, and then there's the thing that they actually did. And you have this very like implicit sort of automatic way of having a sense of what was possible in that situation. And I think that thing, that our sort of implicit ability to represent a set of possibilities in a given situation, something that hadn't really been studied as much, but it seems really important. So this project is an attempt to try and study that thing in itself. In my meeting earlier, I was told that my talk abstract sounded very ambitious, and I think that's probably right. It's a little bit of an ambitious project, but I think it's also trying to point toward an interesting way of thinking about this capacity that we have to think about possibilities. So I'm going to start just by trying to give you, maybe succeeding, and trying to give you, okay, got it. Just to give you a sense for how that you're able to, for the phenomenon, to show you that you are able to do this. So here's a scenario. Daniel is the ring bearer at his sister's wedding. 10 minutes into the scenario, he reaches into his pocket, but the ring isn't there. He realizes he left it on the seat next to him in the taxi. Okay, so Daniel decides to blame it on the maid of honor. And now you could think about whether or not Daniel had to blame it on the maid of honor. And one of the things I think is interesting is it feels like if you read that question, did Daniel have to blame it on the maid of honor? You have an it's just like immediate sense that no, he didn't have to blame it on the maid of honor. But what's interesting about that is like you agreeing that he didn't have to blame it on the maid of honor means that you think there was something else that he could have done. And it seems like we can figure out that he didn't have to blame it on the maid of honor before actually explicitly thinking about what else he could have done. We automatically know he didn't have to, but we don't know yet what else he could have done. So it seems like we must be, in some sense, have access to this implicit way of thinking about the alternatives that were available to him. Okay, so we want to try to study that thing, that implicit thing that allowed you to kind of immediately and quickly answer that question about what Daniel had to do. Okay, so what we want to measure is the set of possibilities automatically and implicitly represented as available in a given context. I'm going to call that set of possibilities contextual modal space, or contextual modal spaces. So I think that thing, interestingly, can vary in different contexts, right? It's not like you have a fixed set of the things that are possible in you just take around with you to every situation. What's possible depends on the situation that you're in, and yet we still sort of automatically or implicitly represent that. So we're going to try to study this thing, this contextual modal space. So the ambitious agenda for the day is that I'm going to try to talk about 5 features that contextual modal spaces have. One is that they're constrained by norms. I'll go on to say more about that, but the possibilities that we represent as available in a given context are going to be ones that like don't violate different kinds of norms. So they're probably not very improbable. They're probably not really, wouldn't be very bad if someone did them. They're probably relatively good things to think about. They're probably like not super unconventional. So I'm going to try to show that norms play a role here. And then I want to argue that these contextual modal spaces are recruited by high-level cognition. So different forms of high-level cognition basically use this implicit representation of the set of possibilities that are available in a given context. That's going to be the idea. And I'm going to argue that a single representation or a single way of thinking about the set of possibilities is recruited by multiple different kinds of high-level cognition. So different kinds of judgments you can make are all recruiting the same underlying representation of what's possible. I'm also going to argue that they're flexible and context sensitive in some interesting way. And if we have time, I'm going to talk about how I think that these are represented and how we're computing what sort of possibilities are available in a given context. That's definitely a lot to cover, so we'll see how it goes. Oh, I also wanted to say, I'm happy to have questions throughout. If I feel like they're not going to be helping us progress through our agenda for the day, I'll probably just make you wait, but I'm happy to be interrupted throughout. Okay. So the way that we started studying this was by thinking, okay, can we use people to generate sort of a set of possibilities that are going to be relevant in a given context? So take a context like the one we've been talking about, say Daniel. we just basically ask people in this situation, what are some things you believe Daniel could do? And then we just ask them, say, to list 5. So here are 5 that one person listed: borrow a ring, call the cab company, tell his sister about the problem, pretend he has the ring until the last minute, or fake a heart attack. These are all things that you could do. We then also asked them not to just come up with those things, but to tell us a little bit about how they were thinking about those things that they came up with. So we'd give them back the answers they gave. So tell a sister about the problem. And we'd ask them things like, how probable is it, do you think that Daniel will do that thing? Or how morally acceptable would it be if Daniel did that thing? Or how normal would it be if Daniel did that thing? OK, so if you think about the sort of resulting modal space along these 3 dimensions, so morality, oops, you guys can't see this. You should now be able to see it. So you can think about this modal space sort of like along the dimensions of morality and normality and probability. Each of these is a point or an answer that participants gave for that one scenario we've been talking about. So you can kind of like look at it, and you can notice there's like some interesting structure to this space. So the different color of the answers depend on which answer number it was. So 1 through 5. So the darker redder it is, the sort of earlier it was in option generation. So you notice that like there's a big cluster up here. There's sort of fewer down here. And also the ones up here are red. So if you look at the ones that they gave, like that are typically up here, it'd be things like calling the taxi company, telling his sister, tell his sister, tell the truth, find the wedding planner. They're all things, this is still answer 4. Yeah, tell the truth. If you look at the ones that are sort of down here, they're things like sabotage the wedding to stop it, go to the convenience store and buy a ring pop, steal someone else's ring. Yeah, or just let the ring continue, blame someone else, etc. Do nothing. OK, so if you think about that, so that's kind of you can think about that as like the space of possibilities for that context, right? And there are going to be sort of some dimensions that seem to influence the possibilities we're generating. You can also just like flatten it. So basically what I did is I just took the mean, I took the mean, why? I can't, here we go. I took the mean rating of those 3 different dimensions, and we're just going to call that like the disvalue of the option. So basically down here would be like everything that is good. Like if something is down here, it's like moral and normal and probable. If you're like way up here on this y-axis, then that means you're bad in all ways. And you can think about how the value or disvalue of the options changes as if you're forced to give more and more options. So here's the kind of pattern that you see. The first answers tend to be the best in all ways. This is true independently for morality, normality, and probability. We just average them to make it easier here. And then as you get to the 5th answer, you're starting to think of things that are like particularly not good. You can also, in this case, this is a manual coding, but we just coded all the different responses into different categories or kinds of responses. And you can get a sense for the distribution of kinds of things that people think about in this kind of scenario. So this is like tell the bridegroom. This is just, it's a histogram. So it's just the number of participants that gave each kind of response. So people really thought about telling the bride or groom, or calling the taxi company, or maybe borrowing someone else's ring. Lying sort of came online eventually. And then there's this sort of thing set down here, which is like, fake an illness or faint, or tell the officiant, or do nothing. And you can also see this pattern where like the lighter the bar is, the sort of higher value it is. So the first answers tend to be better, and the worst answers tend to sort of come online later. So that's this one context. I'm not particularly interested in studying the set of possibilities people think about for this weird case of a missing wedding ring. We also just used a bunch of various other ones. So here's another scenario we used. Heinz's wife has recently fallen ill and needs an expensive medication that is not covered by her medical insurance. They don't have the money needed to purchase the expensive prescription, but they know that it is vital for her to have it if she is going to recover. And now you can think about the set of options that people think about in that kind of scenario. So here's what that set looks like. People often think of things like asking families or friends, or fundraising, or taking out a loan. Stealing medicine will come online at some point, or just not getting treatment. Here's another very different scenario. We used 18 scenarios total. So Ahmed is the captain of a 50-passenger cruise ship. 4 days into their trip, they get caught in a storm, and the engine breaks under pressure. They're now stranded at sea. A rescue boat is on its way, but it might not arrive for a week. Their food supplies are quickly dwindling, and Ahmed isn't sure what to instruct the passengers and crew to do. Okay, if you think about the set of possibilities that people think about in this scenario, this is kind of what they look like. Again, you find like the first ones are the ones that are most frequently coming to mind are often the best, like rationing food or trying to keep the passengers calm. Things like steal the food for himself are less frequently thought of and worse. Okay, so to give you a sense for all 18, this is kind of what the pattern looks like. So you can see some similarity across, there's some kind of similarity across the possibilities to think about across these very, very different 18 contexts. And we're going to use these 18 contexts as sort of creating variation in the set of possibilities that people are thinking about. We're going to use that variation to try to predict people's judgments. Okay, so going back to this kind of scenario, the space that I'm going to be using throughout, this is just sort of a representation, is you can just think about, this is again the kind of like histogram, or this is now just a sort of density plot of this kinds of possibilities that come to mind and how good they are. And that's going to vary from context to context. So that's the one with the wedding ring. Here's what it looks like in the Heinz case. And you can see that the sort of distribution of possibilities changes a bit. Here's the one with Ahmed, and you can see the distribution changes again. This one's much more bimodal. You can think of some very good things he can do. You can think of some very bad things he can do. There aren't so many things that are kind of like mediocre value for this particular context. So the sort of shape of the set of possibilities that comes to mind can change from context to context, and we're going to use that variation. So if you marginalize across all 18 contexts, this is what sort of on average the set of possibilities we tend to think about looks like. We tend to think of very good ones, more or less, and then there's some bad ones, and then there's this sort of like tail. Okay, so all of that was supposed to, you can think about that as supporting the idea that like if you look at the possibilities that come to mind across a bunch of different contexts, largely they're ones that are good. They tend to be moral and normal and probable and things like that. There's some that are not, and that can vary by context, depending on how sort of the particular situation that people find themselves in. Now that we've measured that set of possibilities in a bunch of different contexts, we want to try to see if people actually use that when making judgments or making decisions and things like that. So I think a good place to start is just by starting with decision making. So that's kind of an easy one in a sense, because every time you make an open-ended decision, you have to think of a set of options to decide. So if you are going to, I mean, here, the option for what was for lunch was determined for you. But for a given day where you don't yet have you haven't decided what to have for lunch, part of solving that problem of what to have for lunch is like figuring out what are even the possible things that you could eat, right? You have to think of options to decide between. So this decision making is kind of a nice case to start to study. Is this set of possibilities that we think about for a given situation, does that play a role, say, in decision making, or this one form of high level cognition? So we're going to treat these as kind of open-ended decision problems and ask whether or not these contextual modal spaces basically give us an empirical measure of the set of possibilities that people are reasoning over or sampling from when making decisions. In work that I did with some other people, we came up with a sort of a computational model for thinking about how people are making these open-ended decisions. And so like, let's say for lunch or for dinner, you decide you're going to have tacos. The normal way that that's studied is to think like, if you're studying decision making, you often just like have a set of things that you're presenting participants with. Like, do you want tacos? Do you want lasagna? Or do you want a salad for dinner? And they're choosing. And the basic thing that, there are different ways of doing this, but the basic idea is that you're going to pick in some way or another the thing that you think has the highest value out of that set. And that can be more or less complicated for different decisions. But this is kind of ignoring the like, well, where did the tacos, kebabs, and salads come from in the first place problem? And so what we did in that paper was think about, well, you can think about this as we do it in sort of a reinforcement learning framework, but you can think about all the different possible things that you could have thought about. And then you can generate a consideration set for yourself. So you can come up with options. And what we argue in that paper is you're coming up with options that are like likely to be good for the particular decision problem that you're thinking about. So if I asked you, what do you most want to have for dinner? Probably none of you are thinking of your least favorite foods. Interestingly, if I ask you what's the thing you least want to have for dinner, you often will think of like relatively good foods too. You can, as you start to think harder and harder about that problem, you can probably come up with a food that you want to have even less than the one that you initially thought about. So it seems like this sampling process of thinking of options is one that's biased towards options that are sort of typically good. We find that signature of thinking of options that tend to be typically good to be true also in our open-ended option generation problems, just asking like, what could so-and-so do, right? So we want to try to take this sort of like well-described and empirically validated model for open-ended decisions and think about, can we insert our contextual modal spaces in this? So the basic idea is, can you predict the probability for each kind of action being chosen by thinking about the sort of set of actions is the set of actions in contextual modal space that we've already measured, and then thinking that people are doing something like this. They're creating a consideration set out of that contextual modal space, and then they're just deciding which of those is best in the ones that they thought of. This is one way of trying to, the general approach that I'm going to take in this talk is going to be to take existing models for how we think about a judgment or a decision being made, and then just try and insert the contextual modal space, and then show that that's sort of useful for predicting answers. Okay. So the way that we did this was we took 1,000 sort of artificial agents and simulated them making decisions in these cases by sampling from the actions from contextual modal space, and then selecting the best one out of that small sample. And then what we can do now by coding those kinds of options into like sort of option categories as we had done before, think about the probability for each action category that it would be selected in that given context. We also then we gave people, again, those 18 different scenarios and just asked them a simple question, which is like, what would you do in this case? We then coded those decisions that they made into the same action categories. And now we can think about how well this sort of set of simulated agents using this model, and which involves this contextual modal space, predict the decisions that people will make in these same kinds of contexts. So you guys can, I don't know, yeah, like try it on yourself. Like if you think like, what would you do in the case of like, say, Daniel the ring bearer? Or if you thought about that one too much, like Ahmed the person who's like stuck at sea, like what would you actually do? And then now you can think about like, what proportion of you guys thought of would choose different answers? And what we want to do is try to predict that kind of how likely different people are to choose different kinds of solutions. Okay, so here what we have is like, this is our model decision likelihood for each category of options that you could have in each of the 18 different contexts. So the contexts are just going to be the different colors. And then these are people's actual decision likelihoods for those different things. The relationship here is pretty strong. It looks relatively OK. There are two important things about this. One is that if you don't use the consideration set thing, the model gets a lot worse. So it really does seem like to predict people's judgments well, you have to assume that they're not just like picking the best option or thinking of only one kind of option just randomly and then selecting that, or not doing. You have to have the consideration set piece in this model for it to do well in predicting. The other thing that's interesting is the size of the consideration set that does best in predicting aligns with roughly the size of consideration sets from past work people, which is like somewhere between like 3 and 4 options. So that size in the model actually is what does best at predicting people's responses as well. So I think that's a little bit of good validation. It's if you model it as like people are thinking of 10 different things and deciding the best of those 10 things, the model gets a lot worse as well. Okay, so that's like one little piece where I tried to take like an existing model. I mean, I had something to do with it, but we were more or less not changing that decision-making model at all. We were just trying to insert this idea of like, what are the possibilities people think about in a given context, and then try to model decision-making using that representation of what's possible in a given context. I now want to try to argue that that same representation can also help us explain other kinds of judgments that seem like somewhat unrelated. So asking whether or not that same representation is recruited throughout high-level cognition. So here's another easy one, like the one that we started with, like judgments of whether or not someone had to do something or someone was forced to do something, whether or not they could have done something else. Those judgments also rely on some ability to think about alternatives. And so we want to take the same kinds of scenarios that we did before and then ask whether or not we can predict judgments of like whether or not someone would have to do something in those different contexts. Okay, so here's how we did it. We go back to the 18 scenarios. And remember that we collected a bunch of different things that people could do in those scenarios. We now got new participants. And now we had a continuation of the story. So here's Daniel. And we tell people that Daniel does one particular thing. For each of the 18 contexts, we came up with 6 different options. In this case, the options were call the taxi company, borrow their mom's wedding ring, tell a sister as soon as possible, blame it on the maid of honor, run away, or steal someone else's ring. So different participants would see Daniel deciding to do one of these 6 things. And then we would ask participants, do you agree that Daniel had to do that particular thing? OK, So to predict that, now what we want to do is we want to try to think about each of these options sort of relative to the set of possibilities people should be representing as available in that given context. So if you think about, this is again that sort of histogram density plot of the set of options in this case, and now you can sort of locate each of the actual actions sort of relative to that modal background or sort of set of options. Does that make sense? So we're sort of placing each of the things that Daniel actually does relative to what we think are like is sort of possible in that given situation. And the intuition is like, and this is not a new intuition, but to the extent that you can think of something better that Daniel could have done, you should definitely think he didn't have to do that thing. So by situating each of these actual actions relative to that context or set of possibilities in the context, we can think about like, well, how easy or likely is it that you could think of a better thing? That's just, you can see where all of our actions are across all 18 different scenarios. So we kind of try to cover the spread. Okay, so now what we're going to do is come up with a measure, which is like, well, to what extent were there better options that should have been represented as available in that given context? The way that we do this is just the probability if you were like randomly sampling of sampling an option that was better than that one. So let's say, just to sort of walk you through how that would work, like, let's say the actual action is run away. That's what Daniel decided to do. And now we're wondering, like, well, what's the probability of thinking of a better action of running away if this is the set of options that are available in that context? And this is the probability of thinking of them. So let's say you sample 1, which is recheck his pockets. In that case, this is a disvalue score. So rechecking his pockets is a much better thing than running away. OK, so that would be better. If you think of handing his sister his own ring, these are the scores the participants rated. That would be a score of 32, also better than running away. If you think of panic and alert everyone that he lost the ring, that has a disvalue score of 95, which is worse than running away. So in this case, if you were just using those 3, then the probability of thinking of something that would be better than the actual action would be 0.66. We, of course, don't just sample 3. We just basically, if you sample as many as you want, eventually what you end up getting is this sort of area under the curve. So it's this sort of portion of the space that's just going to be better than the actual action that was done. OK. If you think about not running away but calling the taxi, and you think about what's the modal distance of calling a taxi, well, there just aren't that many options that are, there are going to be some, but there aren't going to be that many options that are actually better than calling a taxi. And so the prediction would be, well, if you're thinking about whether or not he had to call the taxi, it's going to be hard to think of something better than calling a taxi. So you'd be more likely to judge that he did have to call the taxi. And you can think distance here is like, think about, if you're like out looking at all the possibilities from the good ones are somehow they feel closer. That's supposed to be the intuition. So the higher the modal distance, the sort of farther away that seemed like of the relevant possibilities. That seemed like you went way out there to find that possibility of like blaming it on the maid of honor. Weren't there closer, more obvious things that you could have done? It's kind of why we call it a modal distance score. OK, so now what we want to do is see whether or not we can use this method to predict had-to judgments across all the different contexts. So not just Daniel and these 6 actions, but a bunch of the other ones. So here's the case of Daniel. And this is for each of the 6 actions. This is the modal, the modal distance score that they got. Here's how that relates to the forced judgment. So how much participants on average judge that he was, say, forced to run away or forced to borrow his mom's wedding ring. That's what it looks like in that one context. If you do it across the other contexts we looked at, so the one with Heinz and his wife being sick, that's the modal distance score of the 6 actions we chose. That's how it relates to had-to judgments. If you look at the one with Ahmed, that's the modal distance score. That's how it relates to forced judgments. If you now just look at all the scenarios across everything, it looks like this, which is it was quite a nice correlation. I was very surprised that it worked as well as it did. I've worked on trying to predict had-to judgments and forced judgments in a lot of different cases. It's felt hard. It was just like very surprising to see it generalize quite as well as it did. OK, so we talked about decision making and we talked about force. One other case where people know that you have to think about alternative possibilities is in making causal judgments. So if you decide, like, let's say a forest fire happened out in California, and you're trying to think like, well, what caused the forest fire? Part of what you have to do, and let's say you think it was like a gender reveal party gone wrong. part of what you're doing when you're deciding that that gender reveal party had gone wrong caused the forest fire is thinking about this counterfactual, which is like, well, what would have happened if they hadn't had that gender reveal party? Or what would have happened if the, like, I don't really know how these things work, but like I think there's something that explodes that caught fire or something like that. Let's say that that thing hadn't malfunctioned. Like, what would have happened? Would the forest fire still have happened? And so to the extent that you think the forest fire wouldn't have happened if that prior event hadn't happened, you're more likely to think of that prior event as causal of the forest fire. So you're doing this, what's called counterfactual reasoning. It's been well studied in a bunch of different cases. There are nice, now very nice sort of cognitive sciencey models of how we're making these judgments of causal selection. So the thought was, okay, here's another higher level judgment, which relies on possibilities. Like, people came up with relatively good models for that. Can we just try and insert our understanding of, like, what are the possibilities that are supposed to be available in that context, and then see if we can predict causal judgments as well. So in the modeling work on causal judgments of causal selection, the key thing for our purposes is that they're going to emphasize two key features of the alternative possibilities that we're thinking about. The first one is, like, how available is it to think about some alternative that could have happened instead? So if there was, like, literally nothing else that could have happened, you're unlikely to say that thing was the cause. So like in the forest fire case, like, no one ever says, for instance, that, like, oxygen was the cause of the forest fire. But of course, like, if there hadn't been oxygen, there wouldn't have been a forest fire, right? But the idea is, like, that possibility in which there wasn't oxygen in the air is just not very available. So what's important, step one, is, are there alternative things that could have happened that would seem to be relevant in the situation? And number two is, like, the extent to which the outcome sort of depended on that thing happening. So if, like, the forest fire was going to occur, like, let's say that there were, there was a lightning strike, and there was an arsonist, and there was this gender reveal party, and they all three did events which contributed to a forest fire. Each one would have been independently sufficient for the forest fire. Now you're, like, kind of, you're not going to think it's, like, really the cause of the forest fire was the gender reveal party. Maybe it was, like, some of the other things, like, you sort of, and the intuition is supposed to be captured by this idea that, like, that gender reveal party is no longer necessary for the outcome to occur. It would have occurred anyway, even if they hadn't had the gender reveal party. Okay, so the idea is, maybe we can use the availability of alternative events using our contextual modal spaces, and then we can just measure this other thing that I think is important, which is the counterfactual necessity of that event for the outcome. And then maybe we can predict causal judgments in these cases. Okay, so here's how we did it. We went back to the same 18 scenarios. We now have the agent in the scenario make one of 6 decisions again, kind of like the had-to judgment. And now there's a downstream consequence in these scenarios of what happens after they make that decision. So in the case of Daniel, the idea is his sister finds out the ring is missing. She's disappointed and just decides to cancel the wedding. Okay, so now we can ask participants, do you agree that Daniel caused the wedding to be canceled in that case? And we can also ask participants this counterfactual necessity question. So if Daniel hadn't decided to say, like, blame it on the maid of honor, the wedding wouldn't have been canceled. Or if Daniel hadn't decided to tell the groom about the missing ring, the wedding wouldn't have been canceled. Okay, and we're going to try to combine those two pieces. Okay, so the idea is, we're taking the modal distance score again from before, and now we're just going to, and this is supposed to represent, like, how available are there alternatives to that action. So if, like, you're stealing someone else's ring, there's probably, like, a lot of alternatives that people take to be available to that. And then we're going to multiply that sort of availability of alternatives by the counterfactual necessity of it. That's going to give us a score that we call the necessity strength, just borrowing from prior work. And now we're going to use necessity strength to predict causal judgments. So this is just to give you a sense across the 3 different scenarios that we keep talking about how that multiplication looks. But the key thing here is that what we want to do is use necessity strength to predict causal judgments. And so if you look at that relationship across the 3 scenarios, here's what you see. And if you look across all different contexts, again, all 18, this is the relationship you see. So again, it does a pretty good job now of modeling causal judgments. And what's nice is that these causal judgments, I think, seem really a different kind of judgment than, like, the decision-making kind of case that we started with. But remember that in both cases, we're using the same piece of, like, what are the possibilities that are available in that context? And we're just sort of plugging it into what we know to be good models of decision-making or good models of causal reasoning. You can also, I won't go through the details, you can also model moral judgments this way in a kind of similar way, and you can do a relatively good job of predicting how much people think, like, say, the agent is to blame in a given scenario, just using models of how we make moral decisions or decide to blame someone. Okay, so that part of the talk was supposed to just be arguing that, look, this same representation that we can measure empirically in this way seems to play a role in decision-making, in judgments of force, in causal judgments, and judgments of blame. So it seems to be sort of like this domain general representation that gets recruited by different kinds of high-level cognition. That's the argument. There's some other arguments that I think are particularly interesting for thinking that it really is just a single representation that gets recruited rather than like a bunch of different kinds of judgments making their own, each having their own representation of possibilities, and they're just happening to overlap. I'm happy to go through those, but I'm going to try to be more ambitious and get through the other two last parts of the talk. Okay. Any questions? Are we good? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in the last study you just showed us, did you look for a correlation between the causal judgments of each of the two aspects of necessity experiment that you could multiply together to see if one of them was actually
you have to have both. So, and in fact, not only do you have to have both, you have to have them interacting, which is how the causal models think those should work. So it needs to both be that they're alternatives and that the event is counterfactual necessary. So it's a multiplicative relation. You can't model it well unless you have both of those interacting. Yeah, and which just captures the intuition that, like, we were talking about, like, even if there were alternative things, but they wouldn't have mattered, that's not going to change your causal judgments. And even if it would have mattered, but there weren't any, that's like not a relevant possibility, then it doesn't affect causal judgment. So both have to be in place. But good question. Okay. So I'm going to now talk about this idea that these seem to be very flexible and context sensitive. So the idea is, like, it's cool we have this ability to, like, just think about what are the possibilities in a given context. But what I've argued is, like, in each different new scenario we come up with, that idea of what's available or what's relevant sort of shifts in a sort of interestingly flexible way. Okay, so what we're going to do in this case is we're going to go back to the same scenarios we've been using, so like the ones with Heinz and his wife. And now we're just going to alter them slightly. So we're going to change some key feature of the scenario to make it so that what the relevant sort of actions are for Heinz in this case, or what the relevant possibilities are different in a slightly altered context. For instance, suppose that instead of Heinz's wife falling sick, his dog recently fell ill. And now you can think about the set of actions that would, like, just that one change about changing his wife into a dog, like, should try to change the set of actions that you're thinking are sort of relevant in this given scenario, right? It might be less likely to think of, like, breaking into the pharmacy. You might be less likely to think of things like going severely into debt to save your dog. If it's your wife, those seem like totally reasonable, good options. If it's your dog, I don't know. I mean, it depends on how much you love your dog. Okay, so now what we have is, or just show you the case with Daniel. We manipulated these in ways that were, like, they weren't at all systematic. We just tried to change a key feature that either made some of the previous possibilities relevant, that were relevant, irrelevant, or some that were irrelevant, now relevant. So in this case, in the Daniel case, like, it's very similar, except that he doesn't realize he's missing the ring until he's, like, asked to present it. So he's, like, up there at the altar, and he's like, and now he's like, you find out. Okay. So then we asked participants what you would do in these new cases. We have a measure of contextual modal space in those cases. We also have the same set of actions very critically in each case. So we don't change the actual thing that the person does. We just change sort of the background context in which they did that thing. And we can now we just pick had-to judgments. We can try to predict had-to judgments with two different, so say, right, okay. So when we measure modal space, here's the key idea. The actions stay fixed, but what the relevant possibilities are in that context sort of shifts a little bit. So you can see this is just the different density plots for the original modal space, which is this one in blue, and the shifted modal space, which is the one in red. So people, for whatever reason, the Daniel case thought of, like, more of the options were, like, sort of pretty good ones, and fewer of the options were, like, ones that are in the middle. For any given actual action, that's going to change the modal distance of the actual action. So the idea would be, like, well, for calling a taxi, in in the shifted case, it actually should be better. It should be easier to think of ideas that are better than calling a taxi. In the new case, where it's like he's at the altar, you can think of a better idea. But for the original case, it's like hard to think of it. It's harder to think of a better idea. So you can get, or for like stealing the ring. In this case, because it's so bad, most of the space is like better than that. And so they're actually, the stealing the ring won't differ that much. So there'd be some actions where you can really see a difference between like how much there were better options in the context. In some cases, you won't see that. Okay, so now what we want to do is ask, like, in predicting whether or not you think Daniel had to do this given action, is it really important that it's like context specific? You have to really think about the context or the possibilities in the particular context of, say, he was at the altar versus not at the altar, or in which Heinz's dog was sick versus wife was sick. Or is it just something like, look, we don't think people are forced to do stuff when we don't like what they did. Like, it's just kind of when you do something bad, we don't like it, and we say you're not forced, right? Is it really specific to each context, or is it just something like just sort of some general judgment we're making that's not going to vary that much by context? So the way that we did this is we're predicting participants' forced judgments for each actual action. And we can build a model in which we're predicting it both with the shifted modal distance, so the one relative to the context, and the original modal distance. So these are the new actions the new context, the actual actions in the new context. And we're predicting them using the new modal distance measure or the original one. And then we're just doing model comparison. So we're predicting with both. And then we can selectively remove one of the predictors, sometimes like called lesioning a model, and ask, does our model get worse overall at predicting these judgments if we remove one of these two pieces? So if you remove the shifted modal distance, your model definitely gets a lot worse. That suggests that the shifted modal distance was doing some important work in predicting forced judgments, above and beyond what you could do with your just original modal distance. If you remove the original modal distance, your model gets a little bit worse, but not as much worse, suggesting that there's something that shifted modal distance is really doing more of the work here. You can then also just like try and predict the original forced judgments that we had with the original modal distances and the shifted modal distance. Now the predictions completely flip, right? It should be, this is good at predicting it, and that's not, showing some kind of context sensitivity of the forced judgments relative to the options available in that context. If you remove the shifted modal distance, now your model doesn't get any worse. And if you remove the original modal distance, now your model gets a lot worse. So all of this is just evidence that like we really seem to be having this sort of flexible or context-specific way of representing the possibilities, and that's what's really driving our high-level judgments, say, in the case of force. A different like statistical way of thinking about this, maybe it's, I don't know if it's easier or harder, is like you could take the original judgments of like, for each action, how much do you think the person had to do it? And then you could just like look at the difference to the had to judgments when we shifted the context. So if you like more agreed that Heinz had to go into credit card debt to save his wife, like do you less agree that he had to go into credit card debt to save his dog, for instance? And you just have a difference in forced judgments, and we could see whether or not we could predict that difference in forced judgments with the difference in the modal distance score that we came up with in both cases. And then the relationship between those differences, those different scores, is highly significant. Okay, so that's an argument that like, look, these things aren't just like, these things are really specific to context. They're like kind of amazingly flexible. For each new context you're in, you seem to be representing a new set of possibilities that are relative to that new context, and then you're using that representation to make judgments about what happens in that particular context, or to make decisions about what to do in that particular context. So they seem to have this highly flexible nature. So what's interesting about that, I think, is that it seems like it's weird that they're that flexible and that context specific, given that we seem to be doing this automatically or implicitly, right? It's not like each time the context changes, I have to like sit there and think in a very hard way about what changed, like how does that change what's the relevant possibilities? I just kind of like, things change, and I immediately have a sense that like, oh, other things are possible. So it's like interesting that it's both somehow very easy. Usually things that have this much flexibility and sort of compositionality tend to be very hard. So it's this interesting nature. So that really led us to think about this question about like, well, how are we representing this set of possibilities in a given context? Like, what does that actually look like in our minds? I think here are two different options, which both seem very reasonable, and both have been supported in cognitive science. So possibility one is like, okay, here's how I'm getting an idea of the set of the contextual modal space, or the set of possibilities that are relevant. I'm just sampling some possibilities, and I'm using that sample to estimate a distribution. So sampling has been, people love sampling in cognitive science. So you might think that kind of approach is going to work here. What you do is you have this space of actions you could sample from. You just sample some. So like say rechecking your pockets in the case of Daniel not having the wedding ring, maybe handing his sister his own ring, pretending that he has the ring until the last minute, or panicking and alerting everyone. That's your sample. Maybe you sampled 4, and then you're going to use those 4 samples to estimate the distribution of like what are the likely things one could do in this scenario, and how good are they? That's a totally reasonable approach. You might think each of those, when we think about them, they come sort of with a value. So we kind of evaluate each one as we're sampling, and we're going to use those values then to sort of think about that sample relative to the actual action that was done. So say he actually runs away, and now we can think about how much better or worse were the 4 things that we thought of, the 4 alternatives that we thought of, than that actual action. One way of thinking about this in terms of a distance score is just summing how much better each of those options are than the actual action that was done. So this would be what we can call a sample distance rather than like a modal distance. It's just, I thought of a couple things, I'm just figuring out how much better those are than the thing that was actually done. That'd be a sort of like computationally efficient way of trying to solve this problem. Another thing that you might think is happening is that we have this much more heuristic way of representing space. What we know is like the shape of a distribution of possibilities, but not because we've thought of any particular possibilities. We just know the kind of possibilities that are available, and we've learned to create that distribution from features in the context that we're in. So the basic idea is we have this sort of like heuristic representation of the space of possibilities that are available. And then when we see someone do an actual action, say like running away, we're just thinking about that actual action relative to a distribution or just some sort of like density function, not actually relative to a particular sample. And you could just now calculate a modal distance score. And so our thought was like, well, so those are 2 totally different ways of trying to solve that problem. Maybe we could ask which one is empirically better at predicting people's judgments. Is it this sort of more heuristic way of thinking about it, or is it people are actually doing some kind of sampling to estimate the distribution? Okay, here's how we tried to tell these 2 apart. Back to our 18 scenarios, back to our 6 actions in each scenario. And we got new participants, and they're now agreeing how much Daniel had to do each action. But critically, after they give us that answer, we just ask them, like, well, what else did you think about? Like, what other options were there available for Daniel? So now we have the same participant make judgments of whether or not the person had to do something and what the alternatives they themselves thought of. And now we're going to try to ask how good, this is a way of thinking about the sample that they used to estimate the distribution. How good is that at predicting judgments versus just this very general sort of sense of this like distribution of possibilities that you might think implicitly represented as available in a given context, which we estimate just in the same way we've been doing throughout. Okay, we had them obviously rate them, and this allows us to do the sort of like sample distance score for each, like how much better was each participant's options that is like by their own lights better than the actual action that was done. Okay, so we're using this same kind of model comparison. And now what we're going to do for each individual participant's had-to judgment, we can try to predict that had-to judgment in 2 different ways. We could use that how much better the alternatives were that they themselves thought of to the actual action. Or we could think about how much better sort of like there are generally speaking options available in that context as estimated by like, 400 other participants, this was now like a year ago, thought were available in that context. And the idea is we're going to use model comparison and take out each of these and think about how much worse our model gets. What we find is that if you take out the heuristic modal space representation, the model gets a lot worse, meaning that this thing seems to be doing some real work independent of whichever other options people thought of in making the had-to judgment. If you take out the sample distance or like how much better the particular options they thought of, the model gets a tiny bit worse. Like it's not 0, but it's not. It surprisingly didn't get a lot worse. I think the takeaway from, I was kind of surprised by that for a couple of different reasons, but I think the overall takeaway is that it seems like when people are making, say, a had-to judgment, it's not because they thought of specific alternatives and then they compared those specific alternatives to the actual action that was done. They're comparing it to something like their general sense of how much there were likely to be better options in that context. And if you think about the very like initial case I started with, where I told you guys about Daniel for the first time and told you that he decided to blame on the maid of honor, and then you yourself had made that had-to judgment. Part of what I was trying to get you to have this intuition is you can make that immediately without ever thinking of an alternative, right? And if that's right, I mean, it feels very intuitive that we can do that. But if that's right, then it suggests we must be relying on something like a heuristic representation of the alternatives available, not having thought of very particular alternatives and comparing them with the actual action. But this goes against, I think the result doesn't fit that well with a lot of the movement in cognitive science to think about the way that we estimate distributions is often by sampling. So I think it's an interesting tension. And I do want to be clear, it's not that the thinking about the particular ones that participants thought of doesn't do anything. It's just that it does a lot less than thinking about this kind of more heuristic way of representing the set of alternatives. Okay, I think that's plenty. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. We have plenty of time for questions. You're welcome.
Great.
Questions.
Yeah.
Hi, very interesting ideas. There's an idea in the counterfactual theory of causation that I was wondering whether your theory bears on.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea is that if you have a highly atypical event,
Mm-hmm.
that event very often is taken to carry a very heavy causal load.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
If you drive to work the same way always,
Yeah.
then one day take a different route and then you have
Yeah.
an accident, people are more likely to blame the accident on
Yeah.
the fact that you
Yeah.
drive the
Yeah.
same, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering if your theory is
Yeah,
meant
it
to
perfectly predicts. It was designed to predict exactly this kind of thing. Intuitively, what's happening? So our model would predict that exactly. The reason is, if you have a highly atypical event, it changes the availability of alternative, more normal or better events. If there's a higher availability of alternatives, then you should be more causal. So in the causal model that we use, that causal model is actually designed to, not that one. Yeah, this. All of these causal models, yeah, to varying degrees, were built to capture exactly that effect. The way that we are able to capture that is so you're basically that would predict for when Daniel does something bad or abnormal or improbable, you're gonna think it was more causal of the outcome that occurred. We capture that essentially because that means that there's gonna be better alternatives available. The alternatives that are available, we model as whatever people said Daniel could do in that situation. But that's us. This is like in some sense, like a parameter-free model. Like we just estimated that from people's answers. So prior work was basically assigning probabilities or assigning like the relevance of alternatives in a way that wasn't fully determined by data. And our model is fully determined by data. So it was designed to capture exactly that, essentially. One nice thing about the causal stuff, just as a side note, is like people notice that, like, say in your example, it's basically the probability of the action. Like you're highly likely to take one route. If you take a different route, you're going to say you're more causal of some downstream consequence that had. Probability is very well known to have that. It's called abnormal inflation effect. Other kinds of norms have also been now shown to have that abnormal inflation effect. So if you do something immoral, you're also more likely to be the cause. And if you do something that just is not actually immoral or improbable, but is just a weird thing to do, you're more likely to be more causal. What's nice about this is all of those different norms play the same role in constraining like the relevance of alternatives. And that's sort of the beginning of the talk. So they all are predicted to have the same kind of effect in our way of doing it. And that's in fact empirically true. Yeah, the last thing I'll say is we tried coming up with, so a lot of the causal models just use probability. And we asked, like, if you just use probability rather than using our complicated amalgamation of different norms constraining the thing, do you get a better fit to the causal data? Because you might think, if we just have a sort of counterfactual representation separate from that, whatever we're doing in decision making, then probability should really do the most work, and the other norms shouldn't play that much of a role. That's in fact not the case. So all the norms play about the same role in causal judgments as they do in decision making, which is another thing that led us to think it's really some more single representation that's being recruited by different high-level judgments. Yeah.
Where do you think the heuristic null spaces are actually coming from, right? is it seems to me unlikely that given the context sensitivity that like we have a PDF sitting around for each particular context.
Yeah,
It's not gonna
yeah.
be something where we generate.
Yeah, it's a beautiful question. I think that's what's great about this work is it makes us ask this question. Like I think there's now reason to ask that question where essentially there wasn't one before. My take currently, I mean, it's something we're currently working on, but my take is that you must have some kind of compositional grammar-like thing from features of a context to PDFs. So you have some mapping, which is that I've learned in contexts that have this kind of feature, the PDF has this, or probability distribution function has this kind of shape. And so you can, if you learn that function over time, then you can generalize to new contexts. Largely what we're doing is we're taking contexts that share features or contexts that people are very unfamiliar with and looking at how that changes this, right? Because this model assumes the only way you could do that is if you have a context you're already pretty familiar with, or you've seen similar enough cases that you could actually estimate it. So our model should break in cases that are pretty novel. And that's exactly what we're testing. But I think it's such a good question. I mean, but it's also not like neural nets basically do this, right? They map from features of input to essentially, yeah, doing a PDF, right? So that's not like, it's not an unsolvable problem. It is kind of complicated to think about how we learn that. But then I just think, what a great question someone should study. Yeah. Yeah.
Totally fair to ask, but in the judgment of force questions in particular, so when you're asking like, hey, game, I have to do this, is there different ways people might answer based on what they kind of take the modal base of that question to be? Like if I don't know, I'm thinking if I think did he have to do this according to
right.
wanting to stay in his sister's good graces versus did he have to do it according to like wanting to stay out of jail versus is that baked into the context as well? Like is that the context determines which way you take the question? Do you have to?
Right. So I guess there are two answers. So you're basically asking about like differences in modal flavor for like how you're interpreting have to kind of. There are two answers. The simpler and maybe more straightforward answer is in all cases we're averaging across participants. So I have like 100 participants make a have to judgment about a particular action, and then I'm averaging across them. So I'm actually not modeling an individual. I never model an individual except in that one study where we talked about in the last study. I never model individual participant data. I model item level data. So I'm modeling the average, you might think of it as the average interpretation of modal flavor is what I'm actually modeling. And then sure that can be well predicted by contextual modal space. The more complicated answer is that like I basically I'm not super inclined to think that there are distinct flavors for things like have to. The kind of approach that I think is right is that actually we have a mess of flavors, like that it's not clear, and we don't have these nicely distinct flavors for. There can be modals that can encode that lexically, like maybe mites, isn't so mixed, or maybe like bot isn't so mixed in English. Even those are, I think, can be kind of mixed. So the thing that I actually think is what's going on, I mean, as it relates to the stuff that I've been doing on modals and language, like I think our interpretation, like the set domain of possibilities we think about isn't really changed by modal flavor so much as like, what are the relevant constraints in the context for determining which possibilities are going to be relevant? So if I'm in a context where what's really important is like the rules of physics because I'm like in some annoying conversation with a bunch of philosophers or something, then like probably that's going to shift the domain but that's not because I've now interpreted have to with like a different sort of lexically encoded flavor. That's because what's relevant in this context is this set of possibilities, and I treat have to as actually quite simple. It's universal quantification over a domain, or something along those lines. Yeah.
Yeah, this stuff is very cool, and I like it because I think what you're doing is connecting theories of high-level cognition down to core memory sampling processes, this case sampling possibilities. And what that allows you to do is relate, facets of high-level cognition to core variables that memory researchers might be interested in. So one set of variables that you've already explored is the effect of context and situation, right? Of course, different situations bring different possibilities to mind, and that explains differences in high-level assessment. The other set of variables that you didn't really talk much about, and I'm curious about your thoughts on, are individual differences. So different people have different memory sampling tendencies, and your account would suggest that maps on strongly to differences in high level cognition.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of wondering whether you could comment on that, and just your general.
Yeah.
This direction.
So I've been super interested in trying to pursue exactly that. It's the study I think I would need to do is, because remember, I don't think that online what's happening is sampling. I think there are individual differences in basically your estimation of the PDF that are going to be persist across like different contexts for that individual. So what I would need to do is like take a single individual over a bunch of different days, get them to generate like their own entire set of possibilities, like multiple times, so then I could estimate the actual like distribution. I would need to do something like that to get this, like, how would I represent their sort of their individual's heuristic way of thinking about the set of options that are available?
I guess I was thinking not necessarily in the context of the last segment of your
Yeah.
talk, but earlier, let's say some people are more likely to think about immoral actions than others, right? So
Yeah,
we
I
then
see. Yeah.
expect that to
Yeah.
systematically map onto individual level differences in
Got it.
other elements of the.
Yeah, so I tried to look at psychopaths and then like show that they thought of more immoral possibilities. And I found some weak evidence. Then someone found better evidence and published it. What they didn't do was then show that like have to judgments or these other high level judgments systematically vary with that same way of doing it. We do know that some of the judgments, like at least intentional action judgments, do vary with like things like psychopathy, and which would be predicted in that way. So that's a great question. Yeah, I think the struggle is you have to find the right kind of variation in a population to know how the systematic effect it's going to have on sort of like your way of representing possibilities in a context. So yeah, psychopathy might be nice. I was also wondering just like if you get thinking of this as like a creativity measure, like some people think of just like wildly strange ideas and some people are very narrow and think of very few quite normal ideas, asking whether or not that sort of like percolates up to these differences in high level judgments. I think intuitively that seems right to me, maybe from hanging out with philosophers a lot, where it seems like if you start asking about possibilities, they think of the set of possibilities as very enormous. If you start asking them questions about whether or not someone has to do something, they're like the annoying person that's like, well, technically you didn't have to do it. So I think there's some qualitative reasons to think that might be right, but I haven't studied it. I mean, I think what I would particularly love to know is like, what I would love to do is like take well-documented things like that from the memory literature, where I should think there's tons of evidence that this will affect the set of possibilities that's coming to mind for people in a very systematic way, and then just use that to make the predictions so that I'm not like I don't have any free wiggle room, essentially. Does that make sense? Yeah.
What would you predict would happen in situations in which probability might separate from moral obligation, that is, will versus should? As in, what to do if you want to cross the street in the middle of the block or you find a stop?
Yeah, so cases where these two things go against each other rather than they're often like in our world, those like maybe for good, like probability and normality and morality are all collinear. Like people tend to do morally good things, tend to do normal things. So those are collinear. There are cases where they come apart, like I don't know, cheating on your taxes or something. Maybe it's wrong. It's certainly against the law. People do it all the time. So like you have these two things come apart. Maybe jaywalking is another example. What we basically find is that because it's like a bunch of joint constraint things, like the fact that it becomes like slightly more likely in those kinds of cases to say to jaywalk doesn't have a huge impact, that the other constraints still seem to exclude it from the set that we represent, though it will influence it slightly. And then you can see that influence in high level judgments too, so that it all sort of like percolates out or down. I don't know if that answers the question, or if there's a piece of it that I wasn't getting, but yeah. Do you want to? Yeah, yeah, yeah. it's a little, I mean, in these really open-ended vignette studies, it's a little hard to know how to measure that directly. Usually when people talk about that, they're talking about the you have a probability estimate of that event occurring or that stimulus being presented or whatever. One reason to think it's not just that is that these other kinds of norms, like prescriptive norms, seem to influence it as well. And we did an enormous amount of work showing that it's not just that you think it's unlikely people do immoral things. Above and beyond all that unlikeliness, there isn't a separate effect for it being immoral or being abnormal or whatever. So that makes me think that it's not just like error minimization in terms of prediction. If you then thought, well, maybe that just means we need to shift a little bit what we mean by surprisal, and maybe surprisal is something a little bit richer, where like it's going to include this more normative stuff, then I think it's actually very close to my model. Yeah, Florian.
Yes, I was wondering, a lot of the bulk of what you talk about involves sort of these types of modalities that fall into like sort of the root modality is
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so on. And so I was wondering, in other cases like the epistemic ones in particular, or evidence-based ones, we draw some conclusions based on some type of evidence, whether you've looked at those at all, whether things come out differently. So one place where it struck me in particular, right, I thought very nicely aligning with the relevant sort of theories, which we know well, of course, right, was sort of that in the what should we do, you sort of go with, you say, you agree to the had to judgment if it's the best option amongst the alternatives, but you have alternatives available. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if I was making an epistemic or evidential modal claim judgment, whether something had to be the case,
yeah,
right, sort of it seems like as soon as you consider any ever so faint and
right,
maybe unlikely other possibility, then you have
right,
to say, well, no, then I won't say it
yeah,
has to be the case.
Yeah.
And so
yeah,
I wonder what you think about that, if you've looked at it, or how that fits into the bigger picture of
yeah,
what's general and what might still vary
yeah,
about.
Yeah. So I do think you can, yeah. So epistemic ones can look kind of different. The closest thing that I've done to that is try to argue that like what's happening when we have like a very epistemic interpretation of a modal is that we're doing our best to like not allow certain kinds of norms to restrain the modal domain. So even if yeah, so if I can get into a context where I just want to know like strictly speaking or physically speaking, is there any other possibility or something like, or do I have any reason to think something else could have happened? What's interesting is that like that seems to be harder to do. So one thing I did was like had people make like more epistemic modal judgments versus like deontic modal judgments versus just like circumstantial modal judgments, and then but put them under time pressure. And under time pressure, they all look very, very similar. If you give people more time, they can sort of differentiate between those different flavors. So it seems like what's happening is we still start with this default way of having everything constrained, and then what we're able to do is sort of like shift toward the relevant part of space I was excluding. So, I mean, one interesting thing for me about that is that actually looks quite different than the typical way of thinking about it, where we do everything by intersection and start with all possibilities and then just like narrow in with extra rules. Because it seems like what we've actually done is start with a very small part of space that's probably way too constrained, and then we have to figure out how to enlarge it. This is like the problem of permission, kind of like that's a much harder problem to do. So it's interesting that that's actually the way it turned out that humans solve this problem. So yeah, you can get those, but it seems to take extra effort to differentiate, like, and get a real flavor specific reading.
Yeah, I mean, it's impressionistically, I guess it aligns well with sort of, right, the experience we have that epistemic reasoning is hard. Like think of these like riddles with like redundant sort of scenarios, right?
Yeah.
You're often led to jump to some conclusion that
Right.
takes a lot of factors. Like, wait, I put all these assumptions in that I should have.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks.
We can wrap it up. Let's thank
Thanks, guys.